The night was absolute, not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom, not even the deep black of a rural countryside. This was the kind of dark that comes from being underground, behind enemy lines, with death waiting in every shadow. Somewhere in the tunnels beneath a shattered European village in the winter of 1944, 40 men breathed in, shallow, controlled rhythm. They couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. They couldn't risk a flashlight. And somewhere above them, German snipers had them zeroed. They were trapped, but one soldier had an idea, not from training, not from any manual, from something his grandfather taught him as a boy, tying fishing nets by moonlight. He reached into his pack and pulled out a ball of string. What happened next would become one of those stories that sounds too simple to be true. But in war, sometimes the simplest solutions are the ones that save lives. Let's go back to understand how 40 men ended up in that tunnel, and how a piece of string became the difference between a mass grave and a legend. The winter of 1944 was brutal. The Allied advance through Europe had slowed to a crawl. Every village, every crossroads, every stone bridge became a battleground. The German forces, falling back toward their homeland, had shifted tactics. They couldn't match the Allies in numbers or materiel anymore. So they adapted. They became ghost snipers, spotters, ambush teams, small units that could disappear into rubble, emerge to strike, and vanish again before artillery could respond. The Allies called them stay-behind units. The soldiers who faced them had darker names. In one particular sector, intelligence had identified a critical supply route, a road that wound through a village, or what was left of it. The buildings were skeletons of stone and timber. The church had no roof. The houses had no walls, but underneath, the medieval cellars and connecting passages remained mostly intact. A network of tunnels that had sheltered villagers during previous wars now sheltered something else. A forward observation post. German spotters who could call in artillery on any column that tried to use that road. Taking it out wasn't optional. It was necessary. The mission went to a platoon strength unit. 40 men. Their objective? Infiltrate the tunnel system, locate the observation post, and neutralize it. Simple on paper, but war has a way of shredding paper. They entered at dusk through a collapsed cellar entrance on the village's eastern edge. The plan was to move through the tunnels using the darkness as cover, emerge near the suspected observation post location, and strike before dawn. Speed and surprise. But the Germans knew the tunnels too. They'd had months to map every passage, every turn, every dead end. And they'd prepared The platoon made it perhaps 200 yards into the system before the first shots cracked out. Not a sustained firefight, just 2 or 3 rounds. Precise, then silence. One man down, wounded in the shoulder. The kind of wound that makes you scream if you're not disciplined. He didn't scream, but the message was clear. The enemy knew they were there. The unit commander made the call to pull back, regroup at a wider chamber. They'd passed about 50 yards behind their position. They carried their wounded man, moving as quietly as possible. The tunnel was perhaps 6 feet high, maybe 4 feet wide. Stone walls that had been there since the 15th century, cold enough to see breath, dark enough to feel claustrophobic even if you weren't underground. They reached the chamber. It was maybe 15 feet across, with 3 exits. One they'd come from, one that led deeper into the complex, one that supposedly led back toward friendly lines, but nobody was certain. That's when they realized the trap. Movement in the tunnel they just exited. Voices in German, echoing off stone. Not close, but not far. The enemy was moving to cut them off, and the other exits, unknown, could lead to safety, could lead to a dead end, could lead straight into another ambush. The wounded man was losing blood. They'd applied pressure, but he needed evacuation. The commander faced an impossible choice. Stay here and potentially get surrounded, move forward into unknown territory, possibly toward more enemy positions, try to fight back the way they'd come, in a tunnel where the Germans knew every firing angle. If you have your own story about soldiers adapting in desperate situations, or if your family has connections to the tunnel fighting of World War II, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The commander chose to wait, not out of indecision, but calculation. The Germans would expect them to either advance or retreat. Staying put Staying silent might confuse them, buy time until they could figure out which exit route was viable. But they had a problem. The chamber had 3 exits, and they could only effectively watch 2 with their limited manpower in the pitch dark. They needed early warning. If anyone approached from that 3rd tunnel, the one that led deeper. That's when the soldier spoke up. Later accounts never recorded his name in the way history usually does. He was a private, young, from somewhere in the Midwest, farm country. His contribution wouldn't come from rank or combat experience. It would come from memory. He remembered his grandfather, summer evenings on the lake, fishing nets that needed to be set in the dark before dawn to catch the morning run. His grandfather had shown him a trick, a way to know if something was disturbing the net without watching it constantly. You tied strings between points, created a web. When something moved through it, you felt it. The string would pull or slacken or vibrate. Simple physics, elementary engineering, the kind of thing that seems obvious once you know it, but invisible until someone thinks of it. He proposed the idea to his commander. Rig the 3rd tunnel entrance with string, crisscross it at ankle height, tie it back to where they were positioned so they could feel any vibration or pull. If the Germans came from that direction, the string would warn them before bullets did. The commander considered it. They had pair. Every soldier carried some. It was standard, used for everything from securing gear to emergency repairs, but using it as an early warning system. Unorthodox, but they were out of orthodox options. They set it up. Working by touch, they stretched cord across the tunnel mouth. Not just one strand, multiple at different heights. Ankle, knee, waist, creating a net effect. They secured one end to iron brackets that had once held torches. The other end they tied to a soldier's wrist. He would be their sensor. The setup took maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes of careful, silent work. 10 minutes where every scrape of cord against stone sounded like thunder. But they got it done. Then they waited. Waiting in combat darkness is its own kind of torture. Your ears amplify every sound. Water dripping becomes footsteps. Stones settling becomes weapons being prepared. Your eyes try to find shapes where there's nothing but black. Your mind fills the void with fears. The wounded man's breathing was shallow but steady. They'd managed to stop the bleeding. But infection was a clock ticking in the dark. They needed to move soon. 30 minutes passed, maybe 40. Time becomes fluid in the dark. Then the string pulled, not a violent jerk. Just a slight increase in tension. The soldier monitoring it felt it immediately. Raised his fist in the silent signal for contact. Everyone froze. Another pull, lighter this time. Someone or something was testing the space. Moving carefully. The Germans were doing the same thing the Americans had done, advancing slowly, feeling their way, trying not to make noise. They didn't know about the string. Why would they? The platoon had seconds to decide, open fire blind and give away their position. Stay silent and let the enemy advance until they were on top of them. Use the one grenade they had and risk a catch. The commander made a 3rd choice. He whispered orders. Half the unit would fire a controlled burst at the tunnel mouth knot where the string was, but the opening itself, high angle, banking rounds off the ceiling and walls, not to hit anyone necessarily, to disorient, to warn, to create chaos. The other half would immediately move to the exit that led back toward friendly lines. They'd take the wounded man and create a corridor. If the way was clear, they'd signal. If not, everyone would fall back to this chamber and prepare for a last stand. It was a gamble. But the string had bought them. The seconds needed to gamble smart instead of react blind. The burst was deafening in the enclosed space. Muzzle flash turned night into strobing daylight for half a heartbeat. The sound was a physical force. Then darkness and silence again, except for the ringing in everyone's ears. But they heard it. Shouts in German, confusion, movement away from the chamber, not toward it. The reconnaissance element moved fast. 10 men moving by touch along the wall. 20 yards, 30 a turn, then a whisper shout back. Clear, incline ahead. Smells like open air. They'd found the way out. The evacuation was orderly but fast. The wounded man went first, carried by 2 soldiers, then the rest of the unit in pairs, covering each other. The commander and 2 others stayed behind, maintaining watch. The string was still there, still connected to one soldier's wrist. Still there, early warning. If you're interested in more stories about improvised tactics that changed outcomes, or if you know veterans who had to think outside the manual, share those stories in the comments. These moments of human ingenuity under pressure are what history is really made of. Remember to like and subscribe so we can keep bringing these forgotten stories to light. They felt the string pull again. Harder this time. No testing now. The enemy was committing. The 3 remaining soldiers fired another burst, shorter this time, and ran. They caught up with their unit at the incline. It was indeed a way out of partially collapsed passage that led up to what had been a bakery's basement. The bakery was rubble now, but rubble under open sky. They emerged into Prydon Gray. Not safe, but safer. They could see, they could maneuver, they could call for support. The wounded man survived. The unit made it back to friendly lines. The observation post mission was scrubbed. But the intelligence about the tunnel system's layout, learned the hard way, went into reports that helped future operations. And the string, it stayed behind in that medieval chamber. Maybe it's still there. Maybe it rotted away decades ago. But the idea didn't rot. The story spread through the division, then through the theater. Soldiers started carrying extra cordage specifically for situations like this. The tactic got refined, different materials tested, different configurations tried. By the spring of 1945, improvised early warning systems using string, wire, or even bootlaces were standard practice in tunnel operations. It seems almost ridiculous. Ebola string saving 40 lives. But that's often how war works. The grand strategies and massive operations make history books, but individual survival often comes down to remembering something your grandfather taught you, applying civilian knowledge to military problems, thinking beyond the manual. The physics are straightforward. Tension and vibration. Any movement through a taut string creates a disturbance that travels along the length of the cord in total darkness, where sight is useless and sound is dangerous. Touch becomes primary. The string becomes an extension of your senses, a mechanical nerve that reaches into space you can't see. There's a deeper principle here too. In military doctrine, there's constant tension between standardization and improvisation. You train soldiers to follow procedures because procedures are tested, reliable, predictable. But war is the opposite of predictable. The enemy adapts. Terrain doesn't care about your plans. Equipment fails. The soldiers who survive are often the ones who can hold doctrine in one hand and innovation in the other, who know the rules well enough to know when to break them. The string trick wasn't in any field manual. It violated the principle of maintaining light signature discipline. All that movement, all that setup time, all that touching walls and making small sounds. By the book, they should have posted sentries and accepted the risk of late detection. But the soldier who suggested it understood something the manual didn't account for. In that specific situation, with those specific constraints, a simple mechanical system was superior to human vigilance. You can't stare at pitch darkness for an hour without your attention drifting. But string doesn't get tired. String doesn't imagine threats that aren't there. String only reacts to actual physical contact. It's the same principle behind tripwires, but adapted for defensive warning instead of offensive booby trapping. And crucially, it didn't solve the problem. It bought time to solve the problem. Sometimes that's enough. Let's talk about the psychological element, because the string did something else. Something harder to quantify. It gave 40 men something to trust beyond their own failing senses. In that darkness, exhaustion and fear play tricks. You think you hear movement. You think you see shapes. Second guessing becomes paralysis. But the string was objective, physical. If it pulled, there was something there. If it didn't, there wasn't. That certainty, even just for one approach vector, reduced cognitive load. Let men focus their attention on the threats they could potentially do something about. There's a combat psychology concept called cognitive bandwidth. In high-stress situations, your brain has limited processing capacity. Fear, fatigue, pain, they all consume bandwidth. Anything that reduces uncertainty, that automates a decision or eliminates a variable, frees up mental resources for other tasks. The string system did that. It took one tunnel from a known threat vector requiring constant vigilance to monitor the sector with objective alarm. That bandwidth saving across 40 men added up to better decisions when seconds counted. This is why militaries study these improvised solutions obsessively. Not to add them to manuals necessarily, but to understand the thinking behind them. What problem did the soldier identify? What resources did he have? What constraints was he working with, and how did he test his idea? How did he communicate it? Those questions reveal patterns, and patterns can be taught even if specific solutions can't be. In the years after the war, tunnel fighting doctrine evolved significantly. The experiences in Europe and later in Korea and Vietnam forced doctrinal changes. Early warning systems became standard, not always string, sometimes electronic sensors, sometimes mechanical devices, sometimes trained animals, but the principle remained: extend your senses beyond line of sight using whatever means available. If your family has stories about soldiers who improvise solutions in combat, or if you've studied the evolution of tunnel warfare tactics, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. These stories of adaptation show us that warfare isn't just about firepower, it's about thinking differently when everything is going wrong. Hit that like button and subscribe to support more deep dives into these overlooked moments that change history. This string trick also illustrates something about military innovation more broadly. The best ideas often come from the bottom up, not top down. Generals plan campaigns, staff officers write doctrine, but privates and corporals are the ones actually solving immediate problems in real time. They're the ones who know that paracord can be an alarm system, that a mess kit can be a shovel, that a helmet can be a water carrier. This is why after-action reports matter, why debriefs happen even after successful operations. The institutional knowledge that keeps an army effective doesn't live in headquarters. It lives in the collective experience of soldiers who've faced the unexpected and survived. That private who suggested the string probably never got a medal for it. His name isn't in any regimental history. There's no monument, but he saved 40 lives by remembering fishing with his grandfather. That's worth more than bronze or marble. Consider the German perspective for a moment. The soldiers in those tunnels were doing their job, defending their assigned sector, using terrain to their advantage. They had home field advantage, they knew those passages, they had the initiative, they'd set the ambush. They should have won that engagement. But they didn't account for innovation. They expected the Americans to react conventionally, fight back, try to advance, or retreat into another prepared ambush position. The string changed the equation. It gave the trapped unit information the Germans didn't know they had. This is a recurring theme in warfare. Asymmetric information wins battles. Not just intelligence about enemy positions or strength, but information about your own tactical situation. Knowing that third tunnel was being probed before the enemy knew that was the advantage that mattered. The Germans had superior position and probably superior local knowledge, but the Americans had better situation awareness in that critical moment. And they got it from a ball of string and a memory from childhood. There's an equipment lesson here too. Modern soldiers carry vastly more sophisticated gear than their 1944 counterparts. Night vision, thermal imaging, motion sensors. Tactical communications that let you whisper to someone 50 feet away or call in artillery from 5 miles away. But all of it requires power. Batteries die, electronics fail, moisture gets in, cold weather drains charge. And in situations where you need absolute noise and light discipline, you can't use most of it anyway. Paracord doesn't need batteries. It doesn't emit signature. It doesn't break if you drop it. It's so simple, it's almost invisible in your loadout, but its utility is nearly infinite. Every soldier who's spent time in field operations has a dozen stories about paracord saving a mission, or at least making it more bearable. The military-industrial complex spends billions developing cutting-edge technology, and some of it is genuinely revolutionary, but there's wisdom in remembering that simple mechanical solutions often outperform complex electronic ones in harsh environments. Redundancy is key. Have the night vision, but also have the string. Let's examine the decision-making process that night in more detail. The commander had to evaluate an idea proposed by a private in the middle of a tactical crisis. There's a command structure for a reason. Orders flow down, information flows up. Privates don't usually dictate tactics, but good commanders know when to listen. They recognize that rank doesn't equal omniscience. A private who's been a farm kid his whole life might know things about rope mechanics that a West Point graduate doesn't. Experience comes in many forms. The commander took maybe 30 seconds to evaluate the suggestion. He assessed risk versus reward. The risk, 10 minutes of setup time during which they're vulnerable and making small noises. The reward, early warning on a vector they couldn't otherwise monitor. He approved it. That decision probably saved his life too. This is leadership. Not the heroic charge kind that movies love. The quiet kind. The kind that says, I don't care where the good idea comes from. I care that it's a good idea. Militaries struggle with this balance. They need hierarchy and discipline, but they also need adaptability and initiative. The best units find ways to have both. They train their soldiers to think, not just follow. They create cultures where a private can speak up without fear of being shot down for breaking chain of command. That platoon had that culture, or that night wouldn't have ended the way it did. Think about what didn't happen. The commander didn't dismiss the idea as too simple. He didn't worry about looking foolish if it didn't work. He didn't default to conventional tactics because that's what training taught. He recognized the situation was already unconventional and required unconventional responses. That's harder than it sounds. Training creates muscle memory for a reason. Under stress, you default to what you've drilled. Overriding that instinct to try something new takes mental discipline. The entire platoon showed discipline that night. When the string pulled, nobody panicked. Nobody fired wild. Nobody broke position. They executed the plan the commander laid out, trusting the information the string was giving them. Discipline isn't just following orders. It's maintaining composure when every instinct screams at you to act. It's trusting your team, your training, and yes, even a piece of string when your life depends on it. The evacuation could have gone wrong in 100 ways. Someone could have stumbled. The wounded man could have cried out. The exit passage could have been blocked. The Germans could have committed faster. Any one of those failures and the string trick becomes a footnote on a list of casualties. But it didn't go wrong because 40 men did their jobs with the information they had, using the tools they had in circumstances nobody could have fully prepared for. That's the real story. Not just the string. The string was a tool. The story's about men using every advantage, no matter how small, to survive and complete their mission. If you've learned something new about the small moments that changed outcomes in history, or if these stories of soldiers adapting under pressure resonate with you, let us know in the comments. Share this video with anyone interested in the human side of military history, and subscribe so you're notified when we post our next documentary exploring the stories that textbooks miss. There's a philosophical dimension worth considering. War forces clarity. In our life, we overcomplicate things. We have endless options, endless time to deliberate, endless safety nets. Decisions rarely feel urgent, but in that tunnel, complexity was the enemy. The solution had to be immediate, achievable with available resources, and effective within minutes. There was no time to that constraint forced elegance. The string system was perfect because it was simple. Simple to set up, simple to monitor, simple to understand. No moving parts to fail, no expertise required to operate. Elegance in problem solving isn't about sophistication. It's about using the minimum necessary means to achieve the required effect. The string was elegant. We can learn from that. In our daily lives, we often reach for complicated solutions when simple ones would work better. We buy expensive tools when basic ones would suffice. We create elaborate plans when straightforward action would be more effective. The soldier with the string didn't overthink it. He saw a problem, need to monitor an approach vector in darkness. He identified a resource. He remembered a principle. Tension changes signal presence. He combined them, problem solved. That clarity of thought under pressure is a skill. It can be developed. It requires stripping away the non-essential, focusing on core requirements, and being willing to use unconventional means. It also requires overcoming ego. A sophisticated electronic alarm system sounds impressive. A ball of string sounds crude, but crude that works beats sophisticated. That doesn't every single time. The soldiers in that platoon weren't thinking about how their solution would sound in a report. They were thinking about survival. That focus is clarifying. We talk about battlefield ingenuity like it's a special thing, but really, it's just problem solving with constraints. The constraints are more severe, your life is at stake. The time pressure is more intense. The resources are more limited, but the cognitive process is the same. Identify the problem, assess available resources, generate potential solutions, evaluate feasibility, implement the best option, adapt if it doesn't work. The string succeeded because each step of that process was executed correctly. The problem was correctly identified. Need early warning. The resource was correctly assessed. Paracord can transmit tension. The solution was correctly generated. Create a tripwire network. The feasibility was correctly evaluated. Can be done in 10 minutes with minimal noise. The implementation was correct. Multiple strands at multiple heights tied to a monitoring position. And crucially, they were ready to adapt if it didn't work. The string was plan A for that tunnel. They still had plan B and plan C ready if needed. That's the real lesson. Not use string in tunnels. That's too specific. The Lasanis think mechanically, use what you have, test your assumptions, and be ready to adapt. Those principles work in tunnel fighting. They work in engineering, they work in business, they work in life. The tactical situation in Europe at that time made encounters like this increasingly common. As the Allies advanced, the front became less defined. There were pockets of resistance, bypassed units, stay-behind forces. The war became less about massive set-piece battles and more about countless small unit actions. Each one was life and death for the people involved. Each one required soldiers to think, adapt, survive. Many didn't. Many units walked into situations like that tunnel and didn't walk out. The difference often came down to small things. A good commander, a creative soldier, a piece of string. Historians focus on the big moments in Normandy. The Bulge, the Rhine crossing, those matter. But for the soldiers fighting through those winter months, the big moments were abstract. Their war was the next village, the next patrol, the next night in the dark hole wondering if they'd see morning. The string trick mattered to 40 men. It mattered to their families who got to see them again. It mattered to the subsequent soldiers who learned the lesson and used similar tactics in their own crises. Small ripples, but ripples in enough lives to be significant. Let's return to that moment when the string first pulled. Put yourself there. You're underground. You can't see anything. You've been in this chamber for an hour. Adrenaline slowly draining into fatigue. Your wounded buddy is breathing shallow beside you. You know the enemy is out there, somewhere. Then you feel it. The cord tied to your wrist tenses. Subtle, but unmistakable. Your entire body floods with alertness. Not panic. Training kicks in. You signal contact. Everyone responds. The plan activates. But there's also something else. Confirmation. The string works. The crazy idea with the paracord actually works. You're not blind anymore. You have information. That moment of validation, that shift from I hope this works to this is working, changes everything. Confidence replaces doubt. Agency replaces helplessness. The psychological impact of that cannot be overstated. 40 men went from feeling trapped to feeling empowered. Same situation, same darkness, same enemy. But now they had an edge. Morale is combat power. Historians sometimes forget that, focusing on tanks and planes and artillery. But a unit that believes it can survive fights differently than a unit that thinks it's doomed. The string gave them belief. The soldier who suggested it probably felt vindication too. He'd taken a risk proposing something unconventional. Junior enlisted don't usually speak up like that. He could have been dismissed, ignored, told to stay in his lane, but he spoke up anyway, and he was right. That confidence, the confidence to share an idea even when it might be rejected, that's leadership too. Leadership isn't just about rank. It's about taking initiative when initiative is needed. Every person in that platoon showed leadership that night. The private who suggested the solution, the commander who approved it, the soldier who monitored the string, the men who executed the evacuation, the wounded man who stayed quiet despite pain. 40 examples of people doing their part under impossible circumstances. That's what we should remember from this story. Not just the clever trick, the character, the discipline, the teamwork, the trust. Those are the qualities that win wars. Not better weapons or superior numbers, though those help. It's people who refuse to give up, who use everything available to them, who look out for each other when everything is falling apart. The string was just string. The men made it meaningful. If these stories about ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things resonate with you, or if you want to see more content that focuses on the human elements of military history, let us know in the comments below. Your engagement helps us understand what stories matter most to you. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that changed history, one soldier at a time. Consider how this story would have been different with modern technology. Today's soldiers have night vision goggles. They have thermal imaging that can see body heat through walls. They have motion sensors that can detect movement from hundreds of feet away. They have communications equipment that lets them coordinate with support elements in real time. With that technology, they probably don't end up trapped in that chamber. They cleared the tunnels more efficiently. They spot the ambush before it's sprung. They call for support instead of but technology creates dependencies. Lose power, lose capability, equipment malfunctions, lose capability. Enemy finds a countermeasure, lose capability. The string had no dependencies. It was analog mechanical, failure-proof within its operational parameters. No batteries, no electronics, no complexity to break. This isn't an argument against modern equipment. It's an argument for maintaining the best-equipped soldier is the one who can fight with cutting-edge gear and still improvise when that gear fails. The military term is graceful degradation. Systems should fail gradually, not catastrophically. If your night vision dies, you should still be able to operate in darkness using other means. If your radio fails, you should still be able to coordinate using hand signals or runners. The string represents that philosophy. It's the backup to the backup, the fundamental principle that works regardless of technological advancement. There's also a sustainability angle. Modern electronic equipment requires supply chains. Batteries need replacement, sensors need maintenance, sophisticated gear needs specialized technicians to repair it. String is string. It's been manufactured essentially the same way for thousands of years. You can produce it anywhere. You can carry months' worth of supplies. A soldier can learn everything about how it works in minutes. In a long conflict, where supply lines are stretched and industrial capacity is strained, that simplicity becomes strategic. You can't run out of sensor batteries if you're using string. World War II taught many lessons like this. When supply lines are uncertain, when industrial capacity is stressed, simplicity beats sophistication. The armies that could maintain their equipment with basic tools and improvised parts had an advantage over armies dependent on complex logistics. The string is an example at the individual soldier level. The principle scales to entire armies. Let's examine one more aspect: teaching and transmission. How did this trick spread? Remember, this was 1944. No internet, no instant communication. Information moved at the speed of conversation and written reports. The soldier who suggested it probably told the story to other soldiers. Word spreads fast in military units, especially word about techniques that save lives. Someone survives because of a trick. They tell everyone they know. Those people tell their friends. Within weeks, the idea propagates through the division. Officers write it into after-action reports. Those reports get read by staff officers planning future operations. Someone thinks that's clever. We should include it in training. It gets added to briefings, maybe demonstrated in a training exercise. By spring of 1945, soldiers heading into tunnel operations have probably heard some version of the story. Maybe not the specific details, maybe garbled through transmission, but the core idea: use cord as an early warning system. That's how tactical innovation happens in wartime. It's organic, bottom-up, Darwinian. Even the techniques that work survive and spread. The ones that don't die out. There's no formal process, no testing lab, no procurement committee, just soldiers sharing what works and discarding what doesn't. That informal knowledge network is incredibly powerful. It adapts faster than any official doctrine can. It incorporates local knowledge in specific situations. It's resilient because it's decentralized. The modern military tries to harness this with lessons learned, programs, and rapid innovation initiatives. But it's hard to bottle something that's fundamentally about human connection and trust. Soldiers listen to other soldiers who've been there. They trust what works in the field more than what works in theory. The string trick spread because soldiers trusted the source. Other soldiers who survived because of it. That credibility can't be manufactured. It has to be earned through shared experience and proven results. So when we talk about the string saving 40 lives, we're also talking about those 40 lives then spreading the technique to potentially hundreds or thousands of others. The ripple effect of one good idea transmitted through the informal network of people trying to help each other survive. That network is as important as any official supply chain or command structure. maybe more important, some historians argue that World War II was won by industrial capacity and strategic decisions. Others point to specific battles or turning points. There's truth in both perspectives, but there's also truth in this. Wars are won by accumulation of small advantages. 1,000 little things done slightly better than the enemy does them. 1,000 small innovations that each save a few lives or complete a few missions. The string was one of those 1,000 things, not decisive on its own, not changing the course of the war, but contributing, adding to the aggregate capability of the force. Multiply it by 1,000 similar innovations, better ways to carry ammunition, faster ways to dig foxholes, smarter ways to navigate at night, and you start to see how an army becomes effective beyond its nominal strength. The Allies won partly because they were better at this kind of ground level innovation. They encouraged the initiative, they listened to their soldiers, they adapted doctrine based on field experience, not perfectly, not uniformly, but more consistently than their opponents. The German military had excellent tactical doctrine and well-trained soldiers, but their command structure was more rigid. Innovation came from the top down. Field modifications required approval through chains of command that slowed adaptation. It meant good ideas from junior soldiers might never reach the people who could implement them broadly. The Allies weren't perfect at this either, but their cultural emphasis on individual initiative, combined with a less rigid command structure, create an environment where a private's idea about string could become accepted practice within months. That's a strategic advantage. Not a big obvious one, but real. Imagine you're teaching new soldiers about this story. What's the lesson? It's not carry string into tunnels. Tunnels aren't that common in modern warfare. The lesson is about mindset. Look at the resources you have. Think about the problems you face. Ask yourself, what can I use in a way it wasn't designed for? What principle from civilian life applies here? What simple solution am I overlooking because I'm looking for complex ones? That mindset is teachable. You can train it through exercises that force improvisation. You can reinforce it by celebrating creative problem solving, not just be the book execution. You can build a culture where soldiers expect to have to adapt and feel empowered to suggest their adaptations. That culture is the real inheritance of stories like the string trick, not the specific tactic. The attitude that created it. We're coming to the end of this story, but before we close, it's worth considering why this story matters today. We're 80 years removed from that night in those tunnels. The soldiers involved are gone or very old. The specific tactical situation doesn't exist anymore. So why tell it? Because the principles are timeless. Adapt or die. Use what you have. Think beyond the obvious. Trust your team. Listen to good ideas, regardless of where they come from. Those principles apply whether you're in a tunnel in 1944, an office in 2025, or anywhere in between. If you're facing a crisis, personal or professional, ask yourself, what's my string? What simple thing am I overlooking because I'm focused on complex solutions? What resource do I already have that could be used differently? Sometimes the answer is right there. Sometimes you just need to think like a scared soldier in the dark, willing to try anything that might work. The story also reminds us to listen. That commander could have ignored the private's suggestion. He had more training, more experience, more authority, but he listened, and because he listened, 40 men lived. How often do we ignore good ideas because they come from unexpected sources? How many string moments do we miss because we're not paying attention or we're too proud to admit someone else might have a better solution? Leadership is about creating space for those ideas to emerge and be heard. That's true in military units, it's true in businesses, it's true in families. The private who suggested the string needed courage to speak up, but the commander needed humility to listen. Both were necessary. We've covered a lot of ground, from that dark tunnel to Thet and Tar, Nova Mentek and Werber principles of innovation and leadership. But let's bring it back to where it started. 40 men, underground, trapped, dark. One of them remembered fishing with his grandfather. That's the human element that makes this story resonate. It wasn't high-tech equipment or brilliant strategy. It was memory connection to the past, a skill learned in peacetime applied to war. Every soldier carries their entire life into combat with them. Their childhood, their family, their hobbies and skills and random knowledge. Most of the time, that background is irrelevant to the immediate tactical situation. But sometimes, in that perfect moment when a specific problem meets a specific memory, it all clicks. The farm kid knows how to navigate by stars. The mechanic can fix the engine with improvised parts. The fisherman knows about string. You can't train for these moments specifically. You can't predict which piece of someone's background will be the key to survival. But you can create an environment where people feel empowered to draw on their full range of experience. That's what the commander did. He created a moment where that private felt safe enough to share an unconventional idea, where the risk of speaking up was less than the risk of staying silent. 40 lives depended on that moment of cultural safety, on a command climate that valued solutions over protocol. Think about the alternative timeline. The private has the idea but doesn't share it because he's afraid of looking stupid, or he shares it and gets shut down for speaking out of turn. The platoon stays in that chamber, monitoring approaches with human vigilance that inevitably the Germans advance undetected until it's too late. 40 men die or get captured in a tunnel whose name nobody remembers. That timeline was just as possible as the one that actually happened. The difference was human, cultural, about whether an organization makes space for initiative or crushes it in favor of hierarchy. Military historians spend a lot of time studying equipment, doctrine, strategy. Those things matter, but culture might matter more. An army with inferior equipment but superior culture can defeat a technically superior force that's brittle and inflexible. The string is a data point in that larger argument. It's evidence that the Allied forces, for all their faults, had figured out something important about empowering individual soldiers to think and act independently within the framework of mission orders. That's hard to quantify. You can't put it in a spreadsheet comparing tank armor thickness or aircraft range, but it's real, and over thousands of engagements, it adds up to a decisive advantage. Let's talk about fear for a moment, because everyone in that tunnel was afraid. Fear is the constant companion of soldiers in combat. The question isn't whether you're afraid, it's what you do with the fear. The wounded man was afraid he'd bleed out in the dark. The commander was afraid he'd led his men into a trap. The private with the string idea was afraid it wouldn't work. Every soldier monitoring those tunnel entrances was afraid of what might come out of the darkness. But they functioned anyway. They didn't freeze. They didn't panic. They managed their fear well enough to think, to plan, to act. That's courage, not the absence of fear. The management of it. The string helped manage that fear. It gave them something concrete to focus on, a task to perform, a system that worked according to clear, understandable principles. In the chaos of combat, that kind of clarity is psychological armor. When everything is uncertain, anything certain becomes a lifeline. The string was certain. If it pulled, someone was there. If it didn't, no one was. Simple, reliable, true. That certainty let them allocate their fear more efficiently. Instead of diffused anxiety about every possible threat, they could focus their concern on the threats they could see and the tunnel the string was monitoring. That's more manageable. Fear management is a survival skill. Panic gets you killed. Paralysis gets you killed. But controlled fear, fear that sharpens your senses and speeds your reactions without overwhelming your judgment, that's functional. The soldiers who survive combat are often the ones who've learned to ride that edge, afraid enough to be alert. Not so afraid they can't think. Training helps. Knowing your job helps. Trusting your team helps. But sometimes you also need something external. Something that works independent of your emotional state. Something like a string that tells the truth regardless of whether you're calm or terrified. That's another lesson. When you're designing systems for high-stress environments, build an objective feedback. Don't rely purely on human perception, because human perception degrades under stress. Give people tools that provide clear, unambiguous information even when their brains are screaming at them. The string was that tool. If you've made it this far in the story, you're probably someone who appreciates the details, who wants to understand not just what happened, but why it matters. That's the kind of audience we create these documentaries for. If you found value in this deep dive, share it with someone else who appreciates history told with care and context. Like, subscribe, and we'll keep bringing you these stories that deserve to be remembered. There's one more perspective worth considering: the Germans in those tunnels. They had their own story, their own fears, their own mission. They were trying to do their job, which was defending that sector against Allied advance. They'd set up in those tunnels because it was good tactics, use the terrain, force the enemy to fight in constrained spaces where numbers don't matter as much, make every Allied advance costly enough that they reconsider whether this particular objective is worth the price. From their perspective, they probably thought they'd won that engagement. They'd ambushed an Allied patrol, inflicted a casualty, driven them into a defensive position. Now, it was just a matter of time. Either the Allies would try to fight their way out and get caught in crossfire, or they'd wait and eventually have to surrender or die of dehydration. What they didn't account for was the string. How could they? It was improvised on the spot. It left no signature. It was invisible to them. That's asymmetric warfare at the individual level. One side has information, the other doesn't. That information changes the equation. The Germans thought they had the Allies trapped. The Allies knew the Germans were coming before the Germans knew. They knew that gap, that information asymmetry, was the difference. It's a reminder that war isn't just about force, it's about knowledge, about seeing the battlefield more clearly than your opponent, about making decisions based on better information, faster. The string was an intelligence asset, not in the grand strategic sense, but in the immediate tactical sense of knowing what's happening 20 feet away in the dark. Intelligence wins battles. Not always. Not alone. But it tips the odds